Black energy. Life is seething in this soil, which has been millions of years in the making. It has been forever in the making. A mingling of everything which ever whistled here, leaped or waved in the wind. Plants and animals, grasses of this prairie, buffalo and antelope grazing down into roots and back again into the sun. Birds and insects, their wings still hum in this soil. And this swarm drinks sunlight and rain and rises again and again into corn and beans and flesh and bone, the quick bodies of animals and men risen from this black energy.
Welcome to the 397th installment of Ear to the Ground, the Land Stewardship Project's podcast on family farming, regenerative agriculture, community food systems, and local democracy. I'm Brian DeVore, editor of the Land Stewardship Letter. The poem that opened this podcast was written and read by Joe Paddock, a resident of Litchfield, Minnesota, whose work in prose and poetry has long focused on our relationship with the soil and the land through farming. The poem featured here, Black Energy, was written over 4 decades ago, and yet it is extremely relevant today, considering the buzz surrounding the current revolution in building healthy soil via regenerative farming practices. It turns out another prescient work Joe was involved in marks its 40th anniversary in 2026. Soil and Survival, Land Stewardship and the Future of American Agriculture was authored in 1986 by Joe, his late wife Nancy, and the late Carol Bly, all 3 award-winning writers. This book describes the integral connection between humans and the soil, and how an industrialized approach to farming disrupts that relationship with disastrous consequences. Soil and Survival was written during the 1980s farm crisis, and the authors make a direct connection between impoverishment of the soil and impoverishment of our farms and rural communities. The book delves into ecology, philosophy, psychology, mysticism, art, and religion. It's not a how-to manual on stewarding and building soil. Rather, it's a rumination on why we should care about the land in the first place. I recently reread this book, and what struck me was that it didn't just address the threat posed to fertility and water quality when soil is blown or washed off the land. Soil erosion has long been a concern in agriculture, and there are plenty of examples of farmers, to varying degrees of success, taking action to address it. Soil and Survival goes deeper, so to speak, by looking at what the authors call the land organism. Using Aldo Leopold's concept of the land ethic as a stepping-off point, the Paddocks and Bly argue that we are part of a larger ecological community, and that community includes soil. That's a dramatic departure from the paradigm that drives the conventional approach to farming. That model sees soil as simply one component of a production system that can be manipulated with chemicals, iron, and other forms of technology. Under this system, soil is not a living entity. Rather, it's a placeholder for the crops we want to grow, a kind of plant stand we can modify at will. Soil and Survival and its authors play a key role in the early history of the Land Stewardship Project. LSP was founded by Ron Cruz and Victor Ray just 4 years before the book was published, and the Paddocks and Bly served as consultants to LSP when the organization was just getting off the ground. Nancy Paddock edited the Land Stewardship Letter in its early years, and eventually wrote the highly influential play Planting in the Dust. This performance featured a farm woman named Annie, who spoke passionately about the land abuses she was witnessing in her community. During the 1980s, LSP used various actors to put on this play throughout the Midwest, and it was even presented overseas. After each performance, organizers would lead audience discussions about soil stewardship and its connection to the long-term viability of farming and rural communities. But perhaps most fittingly was the role the Paddocks and Bly served in getting LSP launched in the first place. From 1978 to 1981, while working as organizers for the National Farmers Union, Victor Ray and Ron Cruz ran the American Farm Project, an initiative that brought together young farming couples to discuss the culture of agriculture. During weekend sessions, writers and others would talk about poetry, literature, history, culture, and the importance of viewing farming through the lens of a stewardship ethic. Joe, Nancy, and Carol were deeply involved with this initiative, which was active in 23 states. I've talked to people who participated in the American Farm Project, and they told me it had a profound impact on how they approached farming. After that project ended, Cruz and Ray saw a need for an organization that was dedicated to helping farmers act on their stewardship values. Thus, in 1982, the Land Stewardship Project was born. Having accomplished writers like Joe, Nancy, and Carol involved in the group's beginnings is fitting, given our deep commitment to telling people's stories. I recently stopped by Joe Paddock's home in Litchfield to discuss the American Farm Project, soil and survival, and LSP's early roots in culture and the humanities. He's 88 and still an active writer and poet. Joe grew up in town and was a state champion wrestler in high school, eventually going on to be a grappler at the University of Minnesota, where he studied philosophy and English literature. He was also an avid fur trapper in his younger days, and during what he calls his feral years, even spent time in a wilderness cabin on the Kettle River in northern Minnesota. But Joe says it was the time he spent working on Litchfield area farms while he was growing up that sparked his passion for agriculture, rural communities, and the soil. And that passion is evident in what he's written and spoke about over the years. We started our conversation talking about the American Farm Project and how works such as soil and survival and planting in the dust were rooted in the many first-person stories writers like Joe, Nancy, and Carol were hearing in rural communities. Joe also talked about how, after a bit of hesitation, some of the farmers they worked with came to realize that, hey, reading a poem about farming and the land isn't so bad after all. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the American Farm Project. I've talked to Ron Cruz about this quite a bit, and I've actually talked to at least one farmer who was part of that project. What struck me, the more I've read about it and heard about that project, is it was really and it came home to me again when I was reading Soil and Survival. It seemed like it was really an endeavor to try to kind of reignite this stewardship-based value system in farming. We had done so good at advancing the technological end of it, the agronomic end of it, but maybe we were starting to see at the time that this was taking place in the 80s, the negative effects of maybe not paying attention to the stewardship values related to agriculture. Do I have that right? Is that kind of what the point of that?
You do. One thing I can say about the American Farm Project, that it was actually a humanities project, and it was a partnership between the National Endowment for the Humanities and the National Farmers Union. A fellow named Victor Ray was head of it there in the Farmers Union, National Farmers Union, and out in Denver, Colorado, which was their home business or place. Occasionally we would end up out there for something, and there was a camp up in the Rockies that was part of their situation. But in any case, during that particular time, we were really bringing humanities concepts to agricultural settings where we were, and Nancy and I were chosen as humanists for that project with a focus on the land issues. And they had several other issues which don't come to mind, but I know Carol Bly was in community.
It sounds like you traveled quite a bit and you would bring these farm families together, and what would be a typical session? What would it be like? What would you be talking about and doing?
We came, Nancy and I frequently came together. Occasionally each of us go separately. And we had basically the agricultural but more generally ecological concepts in the back of our mind as we worked, and we brought in humanities concepts along the way. The idea of something larger than ourselves, which we were merged in, and it was very moving to me to move out into some of these places where they were a little reluctant at first. They feared getting involved with the emotional side of what they were doing, caring for animals, the love of their animals, etc. And we could open that up with them, and when it really was working, why we would kind of move beyond the practical side of farming into those broader concepts of immersion in the environment and love of the earth and the people that they worked with and that sort of thing. And so the humanities fit in very well.
And it sounds like you did that through, readings of things like Wendell Berry and Aldo Leopold and some other folks like that who kind of been writing about that connection?
That's true. We to some extent brought that material with us, and Wendell Berry was someone that we worked with occasionally, did readings with and whatnot, and so our material, he kind of evolved a little bit from someone like Wendell Berry so that it could move more directly into the practical issues of the local farmers. And so if you read that book of mine, Handful of Thunder, why you'll see that there's a pretty close knowledge to what actually goes on in the field.
I talked to a Wisconsin dairy farmer, he's retired now, who went through the program, and he said it was really, the timing for him was just key because it was the 1980s, we were in the farm crisis, and we were wondering if we were going to come out of the 80s with any family farmers around, and there was just so much stress put on farmers. And it really helped him kind of get reconnected to why he got into farming and the stewardship ethic. And he also said the other thing that was valuable was to connect with farmers from other parts of the country who maybe felt the same way he did, even though they might be doing something. They might be farming thousands of acres of small grains in the Dakotas, or be a corn soybean farmer in Iowa, and not doing what he's doing, which was a more diversified dairy operation. But he said that was bringing together these folks, and because it can get pretty lonely, especially when things aren't so good out there. It sounds like that was an important piece of it.
Probably so. I should mention here, though, when we're talking about this, that there was a very important figure in that American Farm Project, a man named Bill Schaefer, and he became a close friend of mine. He at one time had been head of the Farmers Union in North Dakota, but he also had a doctorate in communications from the University of Indiana. When Victor Ray, who had worked with him a little bit as in the American Farm Project, he connected with Bill and said would he like to direct the American Farm Project, and indeed he would, and we connected. He loved poetry. He let me kind of communicate the project through poetry frequently. There would be other people that would be more linear in terms of their presentation, but almost always I have a poem that fit, and that moved people quite a lot because they were poems that were evolved from oral history that I'd done, and so didn't get any resistance to poetry anywhere.
Really? I'm actually a little bit surprised to hear that.
Yeah, it was basically, there might have been people that withdrew a little bit, but when they heard they were basically narrative poems that told stories, and so it worked really well for us. And Bill became a longtime friend of mine. If you look at, he grew up a farm boy out in North Dakota, and he was very able. In any case, why Bill was terribly important to what underlies soil and survival, and he turned it over to me frequently. He didn't have ego anxieties. He didn't have to run the show. If I could do it better, he turned me loose on it.
So I was going to ask you, but you kind of answered this a little bit, what some of the farmers' initial responses were, but sounds like it was, because that's not something that you associate farmers with thinking about the humanities and the cultural part of it, but it sounds like they were pretty positive.
Well, it turned out that because I didn't come out there as a professor, and humanities professors hadn't done very well in the countryside, but that's not who I was and where I came from at all. And so it wasn't a doctoral thesis that was offered. It was storytelling and poetry, and actually having worked on the land myself. Another aspect of my life had been that I grew up with my father running trap lines, and for a long period of my life, I hung in there with that, mostly mink and muskrats, but a lot of them. And so I kind of during a feral part of my life after I left college, I continued to run trap lines, and I lived in a wilderness cabin up on the Kettle River up here, maybe 100 miles north of the Twin Cities, and that was the first chosen wilderness river, and it was a wonderful place to be.
Wow, so that really explains, I mean, it comes through in your writing, how connected you are to the land. I mean, that's just another example of how you really were connected with it in so many ways. When you were talking to these farmers, it must have really shown through that you had that connection with the land in a lot of different ways.
Well, yeah, probably the college aspect of my life was very important, obviously. And the focus was on philosophy and literature, etc. But they were very supportive. They were very tough. And a few of them were a little resistant to hearing poetry at the beginning, but it wasn't very long before he said, oh, that's pretty good shit.
Well, I guess one thing I was wondering is when you were maybe preparing programs for these gatherings and kind of doing research, were you a little surprised at how much literature there is out there and how much humanities based material was out there talking about farming and kind of looking at the cultural side of it and the stewardship side of it? I mean, everybody knows about Wendell Berry. You know, the Unsettling of America, I think, came out in like 1978 or something like that. But yeah, were you surprised at how much material had been written over the years on this kind of thing?
Not too surprised because I'd been connected to it to some extent. But if I were to think now about it, the Southwest State University had a writing program down there in which quite an interesting number of people. Bill Holm, for instance, is a well-known poet, author, and activist. He and a surround of people in that particular part of the world were very active, very enthusiastic. I wouldn't call Bill an environmentalist, but he certainly told the story, and that was wonderful. But interestingly, that I can say this about Soil and Survival, it came out of the American Farm Project, and it was visionary. And it was necessary for the LSP beginning.
Yeah, that was one thing I wanted to talk about was the American Farm Project and then Soil and Survival and then Planting in the Dust, which was this one-woman play that I don't know how many states it was presented in. Were such, they just, one thing led to another, and they were all, it seems like the common thread is they were really speaking from what you were hearing from people out on the land.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think a very important step for me was that period. I was a poet in residence with at Olivia, Minnesota back in 1975, the year Nancy and I got married. And we were both there. I was having a little trouble getting acceptance of the poetry stuff. And so I decided to turn to oral history. And I ended up doing an extensive oral history project there and ended up with a book called The Things We Know Best, which is probably, 230-page or more book of oral history, and it's good. And those people are, a lot of the people, when you ask me if there were people that ended up being connected in one way or another to the material that I was working with later, I would go back and spend some time with some of them. Names are distant from me right now, but it was a functional part of my evolution, and so I did have that oral history project. And back in sometimes, 75 to 1990, I was doing an extensive oral history project here in Litchfield, which was an outcome of that particular kind of content again. And it didn't end up as a book, but it ended up as a play called I'll Tell You the Story, which sold out several times back in the 1990s and is going to be redone this year here in Litchfield sometime in the summertime.
Well, I really appreciate that because that, I think, really is the Land Stewardship Project got started at the same time as a lot of so-called sustainable ag or family farm organizations back in the 80s. But I always felt like the one kind of niche that we filled, or that kind of the different angle we brought to the fight and to the conversation, was we were so steeped in people's stories from the land and how they connect to the land. And I think that all goes back to, and I know Ron Cruz believed very deeply in that. He was a former journalist, and Victor Ray was a former journalist, and they really believed in that. But it sounds like, boy, they hit it right when they got connected with folks like you, because that's really what you guys are all about, was telling the stories of people who are out on the land.
Yeah, I think that's quite true. The story of people on the land, surviving on the land, but also community, and what community meant to them, what they liked and disliked. They were frequently not necessarily in line with me politically. They tended to be more conservative than me, but nevertheless, why they could appreciate where I was coming from, and then they would. When you told them the stories that were their stories, why, then you were right in the same room with them.
Well, I wanted to talk a little bit more about soil and survival, and I apologize because I just reread it, so of course it's fresh in my mind, and you wrote it, it was published in 1986, so literally 40 years ago. So I realize you're not going to be be able to recall details and that type of thing. But I wanted to talk to you a little bit about a couple of things related to that book that struck me reading it today in 2026. And one of them is that you really did try to take a look at something that a lot of people would dismiss as just kind of a basic, boring thing, which is our soil, and make connections to just how key it is to civilization, how key it is to our rural communities, to our water, to our health. I thought you did a really good job of kind of, here's this anchor piece, and we're going to write about a lot of things related to stewardship, the environment, like you said, community. But then the thread running through all of it is soil. How do we connect to soil? Am I getting that right? That's my 5-second book review of your book, and I know that that's not fair. But is that kind of what you were shooting for there?
Well, I think that's definitely true. I should say about myself, though, and that is that the underlying guiding aspect of where I went and what I did had to do a lot with my relationship to the depth psychologist Carl Jung, and dream guidance and emergence from the unconscious were terribly important to me. I actually have my last printed book is called Infinity's Edge, Jung, Tao, and the Poet's Way. And it's not a book that most people are happy to read, but probably in the middle of it, it moves into something more related to my process. That was, I went through a midlife period of sickness, which I related to what happened to Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud. They both had the midlife sickness, and I definitely went through that. And it took me several years to work my way through it, after which essentially was when I began to do this work. So there were 15 years which I have described as feral years until I entered into the sort of activism that I lived with for quite a few years.
One of the things, too, that struck me is you folks were writing about soil back in the 1980s, and the science, we had learned a lot about soil, whatever, but it was a lot of it was that post-World War II. What can we do? What response can we get from soil from adding chemicals and approaching it from a very mechanistic, reductionist approach and putting inputs on? And we'd seen corn yields go off the hook and all of that and all of that, but then we were starting to see the negative results of that. For me, working at Land Stewardship Project, the past decade or so has been so exciting because the soil health aspect is starting to come back into the conversation, and the science is starting to catch up to that. We're seeing farmers who are seeing things on their land, and then they're going to the scientists and saying, "How's come I'm seeing this?" And the scientists are going back to the textbooks. And anyway, with your book, you really kind of hinted at that there is that this is all a connection, that it is an incredibly diverse biome, and you didn't maybe have quite the science that we have today, but you could sense that probably, and it probably came from talking to farmers, that kind of thing. It's really interesting to see how it's a very relevant book, even though it's 40 years old, even just from looking at it at soil.
I return to once in a while because it was visionary and underlies wherever LSP has gone. But I should say, too, that I was quite moved by seeing a shift away from increased technology, financial approaches, big farming, et cetera, into opportunities to grow food organically, which is important to me even today. And I would guess that that opened up a whole new realm for me of possibilities. We had the vision in writing Soil and Survival, but then I began to see the possibilities emerge from the vision. And even though increasingly, as Soil and Survival didn't offer technical help on how to farm, and I got a little feedback on that from the book, but nevertheless, why I realized that it had emerged from that, and I felt a closeness to wherever the project went.
Yeah, I think one of the points you make repeatedly throughout the book is, well, we've proved we have the techniques. We even have the techniques to farm in a more sustainable manner. We just don't. What we're lacking maybe is the ethical motivation to do it in a way that is going to connect it more with that natural biome and kind of work with the biology and work with nature kind of thing.
Well, you have kind of a stiff competition from the organizations and whatnot that want to sell you the contemporary big farming, technological, chemical approach to farming that LSP has offered us a new direction from. And I never had any question that that was a good way to go.
You hinted at this a little bit, that the response, some people were like, oh, this isn't telling me how to farm or how to, it talks about the importance of cover cropping, but it doesn't tell me how to put in a cover crop or whatever. So that was some of the feedback. But in general, so do you recall some of the feedback you got at the time when it came out?
Oh, I think people liked the idea a lot, and most of the people surrounding me were people more like yourself that were working with the farmers and whatnot. So I was communicating to you and a lot of others, Ron Cruz types and whatnot, as they were approached. But increasingly, I was led to use Soil and Survival type content to give talks, and these were mostly around Minnesota. I probably gave 20 or more such talks, but I also ended up doing talks in Montana and the Dakotas, southern Canada, and down south to Missouri was a place where I ended up a couple times.
What was your hope that the audience would be? And I guess did that work out? What kind of audience did you have for the book?
Well, generally, there were people that were kind of members of a project that related. Not always, but it made a big difference. If there were people that were some kind of conservation project people in a given community, I could sit down with them and they were just a goggle and a glow with what I had to say. But if I can remember getting into some pretty stiff talking down in Worthington once when I was brought down there to give a talk, and there were a lot of people there that disagreed with me seriously. And
what were their disagreements?
They were disagreeing, I guess, largely with the idea that we should move away from more chemical and technological farming. We've moved towards smaller farming, the sort of thing that LSP has worked toward and has been pretty successful in not major in terms of agriculture, but they've made a place for themselves. And it's an opportunity which will probably be growing, I would think, as the years go by, and it's a possibility when things go wrong in the other way.
I'm saddened to hear that, because I think, particularly in the 80s, it was becoming clearer and clearer that the diminishment of the soil is connected to the diminishment of the land. The closed stores on Main Street, less farms on the land, closed schools. Those two really went hand in hand. So it saddens me to hear that people weren't, because that book, I think, helps make that connection, that those two go together.
Yeah, well, these people that came there was just, it was some kind of event that I was supposed to be one of several people talking, and there might have been a local legislator there and other people. So I came in and I was supposed to kind of give the feeling tone speech, and there was probably 150 people in that group. And it wasn't very long before I was getting barked at when I was talking about, the sort of things that we value through LSP's vision of what agriculture could and should be. But little by little, we came, they accepted my stories. I could tell them about some stories about local people, actually, that had gone through problems, and someone's barn had blown down when he was working on it. I can't remember that. And I told him that story about it. And all of a sudden, those people knew about that particular story. And all of a sudden, I had a kind of bunch of people that were having fun with me anyway.
They could identify with that. Well, I think that's a key point of that book is not to besmirch your major in college, but if it was just this book length philosophy, here's my philosophy on how we should steward the land. Yeah, they would have maybe a reason to ignore it. But it had been steeped in. You had talked to farmers. You had gone through the American Farm Project. You'd worked on farms. You had that connection to the land where you could refer to that in between, kind of saying, yeah, this is maybe a direction we should be going.
The key here is that you don't talk philosophy. The philosophy that's ingrained in you will go and integrate itself into the situation that you're dealing with.
I was going to, this is always dangerous, but I'm going to read back a quote from this is on page 21 of your book, because it really struck me, and it really was like, okay, this is really gets at the theme of why a book like this is important. You write, it is through farmland that the energy of the universe, of creation, flows into and through us, our lives, and our works. I kind of feel like that says it all right there.
That does say an awful lot, yeah. And that's definitely my vision, especially at that particular time where I was working.
Well, it struck me because it really gets at farmland is what feeds us. And so it really is our connection to the earth, and to the ecosystem, even if we don't realize it, walking into the grocery store. But it really is. Whether we like it or not, that is a connection. So it really makes a difference how we are treating that farmland.
Yeah, well, you don't eat without the earth. It all of it, literally all of it, in one way or another, rises up from the earth, evolves in one way or another, and goes back down in. And so far, we're pretty lucky, most of us. We continue on for quite a long time, but there's an awful lot of what comes up and goes down and enters into that feed cycle that we enjoy and appreciate and have no other option for.
So you must have been here when Nancy was... So Planting in the Dust is another thing we've referred to, which was a very seminal piece of work, this one-woman play about soil conservation. And it's another example of, I remember hearing stories, I never had the opportunity to see it performed live, but I remember hearing stories of whoever the actress would be that would present the play afterwards. Yeah. People would come up and say, maybe this is something they wouldn't have been generally comfortable talking about what was happening in their community as far as abuse of the land, that kind of thing. Particularly women in the community weren't comfortable with it, but they felt like they were speaking to this character, and that they felt more comfortable talking about some of the things that really concerned them about the direction farming was going. You must have been here when she was writing that and going through revisions and all of that. Can you talk a little bit about that, kind of that? This isn't just a play to kind of say, this is the way things are. It was a way really to help open up a dialogue in the community.
Yeah, and it was, in part at least, based on the talks that I was giving around the countryside, and her woman, Annie, Annie was giving essentially or roughly the same talk, but integrated into the feminist world or the world that Nancy knew of. And so the material was close to home for me, and we kept some distance. I helped her with some things, but she wouldn't let me. On occasion, I did some things that she was happy that I'd done afterward.
Well, thanks for sharing that about Planting in the Dust, because I think that it was it was just another way for people on the land to speak out. And here, it wasn't just this actress out there speaking for people, even though that was based on stories that you had gathered and you folks had gathered through oral histories and through the American Farm Project. But then it helped kind of prime the pump for people at these meetings. I know I've talked to organizers who facilitated those meetings and said, it really primed the pump for people to then share their own stories and to kind of say, this is, I can identify with this. I can totally identify with what this character's going through.
Yeah, well, interestingly, some very good actresses showed up, and they really dug into it and were moved by it, and they moved a lot of people, and some of them traveled with it. Others places would discover it, they want to show it. And so there were places in Western Canada and the Prairie provinces where it was done, and quite a lot of times in the Montana area, probably in the wheat fields part of Montana, but actually up in the Big Lake area toward the western part, there was quite a lot going on there at that time. And sometimes I would travel with Nancy because she would go to these things for the discussion that followed upon the event. And so always that was a key to it, is that they do it and then they would open it up and probably have some follow-up questions. And so they would ask the people about it, and they would ask the actress, and little by little, why, they were all involved in presenting this play. And it worked really well, and it was short enough, too. I believe the acting time was probably a little more than a half an hour, and so you had a lot of time and energy afterwards. It was good, and so people were moved by it. Then all of a sudden, why, it opened up to good discussions.
I still run into people who know nothing else about the Land Stewardship Project, but they saw that play at one point. And I think I heard at one time it was even presented in Russia at one point. So it really got far and wide.
It was over in, if it was Russia, it was somewhere in Eastern Europe in any case, and it may have been several places there. And it was that they picked it up. I don't think that LSP had anything to do with it. They just got the script somehow or another, and they loved it, and it was translated, I think. I doubt if it was in English at that point, but I'm not sure.
So that book was published in 1986. You even longer than that, you were kind of working around these stewardship issues and helping share those stories and help folks kind of connect with kind of that stewardship ethic and that type of thing. Here we are in 2026. How do you kind of feel about how far we've come, or maybe haven't come, as far as agriculture? Now, what we used to call it sustainable ag. Now it's called regenerative agriculture. That movement, the soil health movement, but also just in general, there's some really bad news out there. We're in another farm crisis. Seems like an ongoing farm crisis right now. But in general, how do you feel about where we're at right now?
I think it's very mixed. There are things like LSP, and there are a lot of small farmers that might be working in and around the Twin City area, for instance, with, I believe, poultry farms and probably pork farms and things like that. And of course, the whole matter of vegetable farms are a big deal now, and all of that is on the LSP side good stuff. And I think most of these people probably are pretty close to LSP or are quite aware of it and believe in the organic approach to, certainly when you're doing vegetables and whatnot for the market, less involved with, probably because chemicals are costly and kind of distasteful. It's probably harder to go to a farmer's market and sell something that has been chemically farmed than if you can say that this is organic. And so there's a lot of that sort of thing going on. But around here, I would say the corn and soybean farming, they may have more awareness now that they have a responsibility to the land. I'm not too close to a lot of them, but here and there I am quite aware that there are people that are thinking in terms of doing the best they can with the land, and they are trying to, probably do some grazing with their stock in off seasons and whatnot, and planting a cover crop in the fall. And so these sorts of approaches probably to some extent are an outcome of what we've been doing and you've been doing.
Yeah, it's definitely a mixed situation. I will say, I'll speak for myself after rereading your book and the work that we're doing now with soil health and the soil health hubs that we're working with farmers. And it is kind of going back to, because the Land Stewardship Project got started out initially as a response to extreme soil erosion that was rivaling the Dust Bowl kind of thing. It's really, to me, it's a very mixed situation, both environmentally and economically in farm country right now. But rereading your book, I realized, wow, you were really onto something, and we are really starting to see, especially young beginning farmers, that is a real motivation for them, is soil health. I think that's really neat to see.
Yeah, and when you mention that, I realize now that at the beginning we were mostly just talking about soil erosion and hadn't gone into the broader picture that it's evolved into. And I do think something like Soil and Survival probably helped to open up the broadening approach.
I have one other request. I was wondering if it would be possible for you to read on tape here, Black Energy for me.
Black energy. Life is seething in this soil, which has been millions of years in the making. It has been forever in the making. A mingling of everything which ever whistled here, leaped or waved in the wind. Plants and animals, grasses of this prairie, buffalo and antelope grazing down into roots and back again into the sun. Birds and insects, their wings still hum in this soil. And this swarm drinks sunlight and rain and rises again and again into corn and beans and flesh and bone, the quick bodies of animals and men risen from this black energy.
For more on soil and survival, the American Farm Project, and planting in the dust, see the podcast page for Ear to the Ground episode 397 at landstewardshipproject.org. If you have comments or suggestions about this podcast, contact Brian DeVore at bdevore@landstewardshipproject.org, or you can call 612-816-9342. By the way, it helps us greatly if you can give Ear to the Ground a rating on whatever podcast platform you utilize. And word of mouth is the best way to spread the news about our podcast. If you like what you hear, tell at least one person about LSP's Ear to the Ground. Thanks to Laura Borgendale, Western Minnesota musician, for Ear to the Ground's theme music. And a special thank you to all of Land Stewardship Project's members who make initiatives such as this podcast possible. If you're not a member, visit landstewardshipproject.org to learn how you can support LSP. Thanks for listening.